Right now, you've probably seen photos of ancient ruins glowing on your phone screen, tagged, geolocated, ready for anyone to find with a single search. Every hidden place on Earth today seems to eventually end up mapped, photographed, and pinned for anyone willing to look. But for centuries, one of the most spectacular cities ever built by human hands was completely erased from the Western world's memory, hidden behind solid rock, and known only to a small group of people who wanted to keep it that way. So why was this city built to be forgotten? Let's go back to the beginning. Carved directly into rose-colored sandstone cliffs in what is now southern Jordan, this city was built by the Nabataeans, an Arab trading civilization that rose to prominence more than 2,000 years ago. Before they became known for carving palaces into rock, the Nabataeans were nomadic traders, moving through the harsh desert landscapes of the Arabian Peninsula. Over generations, they transitioned from a mobile trading people into settled rulers of one of the wealthiest kingdoms in the ancient Near East. The Nabataeans controlled some of the most valuable trade routes in the ancient world, moving frankincense, myrrh, spices, and silk between Arabia, the Mediterranean, and beyond. At the height of their influence, these goods were worth staggering sums. Frankincense and myrrh were used in religious ceremonies, medicine, and luxury goods across the entire Mediterranean world. Controlling their supply meant controlling enormous wealth, and controlling a trade route this valuable meant one thing above everything else: secrecy. Here's where it gets interesting. The city's main entrance isn't a gate or a road, it's a narrow, winding gorge called the Sek, barely wide enough for a few people to walk through side by side, with rock walls rising more than 200 feet on either side. This wasn't an accident of geography. The Nabataeans deliberately chose this location because the natural rock formations made the city nearly impossible to spot, approach, or attack unless you already knew exactly where you were going. Think about that. An entire city, capable of holding tens of thousands of people, hidden behind a crack in the desert that most travelers would walk straight past without ever noticing. But secrecy alone couldn't sustain a city this size. The Nabataeans also had to solve a much harder problem: survival in one of the driest regions on Earth. This is where their engineering becomes remarkable. The surrounding desert receives only a small amount of rainfall each year, and most of it arrives suddenly, in short, violent flash floods rather than steady rain. Instead of treating this as an obstacle, the Nabataeans built one of the most sophisticated water management systems of the ancient world. They carved narrow channels directly into the rock walls of the Sik to guide floodwater safely through the gorge, built dams to hold back sudden surges, cisterns to store water for months, and clay pipes to distribute it throughout the city. Some of these channels and cisterns still function today, nearly 2,000 years later. This wasn't just clever engineering, it was survival architecture, built by people who understood their environment more precisely than almost anyone else in the ancient world. But here's the strange part about the secrecy itself. Historians believe the Nabataeans intentionally kept the city's exact location and trade practices hidden from outsiders, including rival merchants and even some of their own trading partners. Classical writers from the Greek and Roman world occasionally mentioned a wealthy desert people controlling incense routes, but few outsiders ever actually saw the city itself. It existed almost as a rumor to most of the ancient Mediterranean world, a place people had heard of, but almost no one who wasn't Nabataean could accurately describe. That secrecy worked exactly as intended for a while. By the 1st century AD, the city had grown into something extraordinary. Elaborate facades were carved directly into the sandstone cliffs, including massive structures with columns, pediments, and detailed stonework that blended Hellenistic, Egyptian, and local architectural styles into something entirely unique. A large theater capable of seating thousands of people was carved into the rock. Temples, tombs, and administrative buildings filled the valley floor. At its peak, historians estimate the city may have supported a population of tens of thousands of people, an extraordinary number for a settlement hidden inside a narrow desert canyon. Then, something happened that no wall or hidden gorge could stop. In 106 AD, the Roman Empire annexed the Nabataean kingdom, absorbing its trade networks into Rome's own economy. Once Rome controlled the incense routes directly, much of the economic reason for the city's existence began to fade. Trade patterns shifted. New maritime routes opened, moving goods by sea rather than through desert caravans. And slowly, the city that had once controlled a fortune in spice and incense trade became less central to the ancient world's economy. Here's where everything changes. Over the following centuries, a series of earthquakes, including a major one in 363 AD, damaged much of the city's infrastructure, including its critical water management systems. Cisterns cracked, channels shifted, buildings that had stood for centuries began to crumble. As the water systems failed and trade routes moved elsewhere, the population gradually declined. Byzantine Christians later occupied parts of the city, converting some structures into churches, and archaeological evidence shows some continued activity for several more centuries. But by the time of the early Islamic period, the city was largely abandoned by the outside world, known mainly to local Bedouin tribes who continued living in and around the area, using the ancient tombs and caves for shelter. For roughly 1,000 years, this happened. While local communities never truly forgot the site, it disappeared almost entirely from Western knowledge. Medieval European maps didn't mark it. Historical texts barely mentioned it. It became, for much of the world, essentially a myth, an old story about a lost desert city that may or may not have actually existed. European scholars who had read ancient Greek and Roman references to a wealthy hidden Arabian city had no reliable way to locate it, and many assumed such accounts were simply exaggeration. Except it hadn't gone anywhere at all. It was simply hidden behind a gorge that swallowed it from view, kept alive only in local memory and the accounts of Bedouin communities who had no reason to advertise its existence to outsiders. That changed in 1812. A Swiss explorer named Johann Ludwig Burckhardt, traveling in disguise as a Muslim scholar because the region was considered dangerous and largely closed to European travelers, heard local rumors about ruins hidden somewhere in the mountains near Wadi Musa. Burckhardt had spent years studying Arabic language and Islamic customs, specifically to be able to travel through regions of the Middle East that were otherwise inaccessible to Europeans at the time. He convinced a local guide to take him there, claiming he wanted to sacrifice a goat at a nearby tomb believed to be sacred. A cover story designed specifically to avoid revealing his true purpose of documenting the ruins. Revealing genuine archaeological curiosity, historians note, could have ended the expedition immediately or put him in serious danger. When he finally walked through the narrow Syke and the city opened up in front of him, carved facades, rising directly out of solid rock, he became the first European in centuries to lay eyes on what local communities had quietly protected all along. He was only able to spend a short time documenting what he saw, careful not to arouse suspicion, but his written account, published after his death, introduced the city to the Western world for the first time in generations. What followed was decades of renewed exploration, mapping, and eventually large-scale archaeological work throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, gradually revealing the true scale of what had been hidden. Structures that had been assumed to be simple tombs turned out to be part of a much larger urban network, including residential areas, marketplaces, and administrative complexes that archaeologists are still working to fully map today. So here's the full picture. This city wasn't lost the way people often imagine lost cities to be, buried, sunken, or destroyed. It was hidden by design from the very beginning, built inside a natural fortress specifically chosen to control who could find it and who couldn't. Its builders combined that natural secrecy with extraordinary engineering, turning one of the harshest environments on Earth into a thriving trade capital. When its economic purpose faded and trade routes shifted elsewhere, the outside world simply stopped looking, and the same geography that had once protected a fortune in spice trade quietly erased the city from most of the world's memory for nearly 1,000 years. It took one determined explorer, willing to walk through a narrow crack in the rock on nothing but rumor and a fabricated cover story, to bring it back into global awareness. And even then, it took generations of further exploration to understand just how much had been hidden in that valley. Today, this site draws millions of visitors every year, and yet archaeologists estimate that a significant portion of the ancient city, believed to be as much as 90% by some estimates, still remains unexcavated, buried beneath centuries of sand and sediment. Maybe that's the real lesson hidden in a city built to disappear. Sometimes the most remarkable places aren't lost because no one remembers them. They're lost because someone, long ago, wanted them to be very hard to find. And sometimes, even after they're found again, most of the secret still remains buried beneath the surface. If you enjoy exploring the world's greatest mysteries, consider subscribing for more.